The lawyer's words had sounded like something from a fairy tale, a bequest so peculiar that I had actually laughed out loud in the sterile conference room, because who inherits a lighthouse in the 21st century, who has a grandfather who secretly bought a decommissioned lighthouse on a remote stretch of the Maine coast and never mentioned it to anyone, and who, at 33, finds themselves suddenly responsible for a piece of maritime history that they have absolutely no idea what to do with? My grandfather had passed away last month, a quiet man who had always been something of an enigma, a collector of oddities and a keeper of secrets, and the revelation that he had purchased a lighthouse from the state decades ago as some kind of hobby project had sent ripples of disbelief through the entire family. Nobody knew he still owned it, nobody had ever visited it with him, and nobody had any idea why he had chosen me, of all his grandchildren, to be the steward of this strange and unexpected inheritance. I had driven up to Maine last weekend, my GPS leading me down increasingly narrow roads until the pavement gave way to gravel and the gravel gave way to a winding dirt path that seemed to lead straight into the Atlantic Ocean. The lighthouse appeared suddenly, a white tower rising from the rocky point with a kind of defiant grace, battered by decades of salt spray and coastal storms but still standing, still beautiful in a rugged, weather-beaten way that spoke of resilience and endurance. The keeper's cottage attached to it was in remarkably good condition, a modest structure that had been maintained with surprising care while the tower itself had been left to the mercy of the elements, and as I stood there, the wind whipping around me and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks filling the air, I felt the full weight of the decision that now rested on my shoulders, a decision that would determine whether this piece of my grandfather's legacy would be preserved or lost forever. The tower, I had learned from the faded documents in the cottage, was over 100 years old, constructed in the late 19th century when Maine's coastline was dotted with lighthouses that guided ships through treacherous waters and kept sailors safe from the jagged rocks that lurked just beneath the surface. It had been decommissioned sometime in the mid-20th century, its beacon replaced by automated navigation systems that rendered human keepers obsolete, and it had sat on this rocky point ever since, slowly deteriorating while the world moved on around it. My grandfather had purchased it in the 1980s, apparently paying a pittance for the privilege of owning a piece of history, and he had spent the intervening decades making occasional trips to the property, doing minor repairs, maintaining the cottage, and keeping the lighthouse standing against the relentless assault of the elements. The whole property was maybe 2 acres, a tiny slice of coastline that was almost entirely inaccessible, reachable only by that narrow gravel path that wound through scrubby coastal vegetation and ended at a small parking area that could barely accommodate a single car. It was beautiful, undeniably so, with panoramic views of the ocean and a sense of isolation that was both peaceful and slightly unnerving, but it was also a burden, a monument to a man I had loved but never fully understood, and a reminder of the immense responsibility that came with owning a century-old structure that was slowly but surely falling apart. Here was the problem in its simplest terms. I did not live anywhere near the coast. I had a full-time job that I genuinely loved and that required my presence in a city 800 miles away, and I did not have the kind of money it would take to fully renovate a 100-year-old lighthouse that had been exposed to the harsh Maine winters for decades. The estimates I had received from contractors were staggering, 5-figure sums just to stabilize the tower, 6 figures to bring it up to code, and more than I could ever afford to fully restore it to its former glory. The cottage was in better shape, but it still needed work, new plumbing, updated electrical systems, a roof that didn't leak when the rain came in sideways, all the mundane but expensive renovations that come with owning an old building. I had seen what had happened to other decommissioned lighthouses in Maine, some of which had been sold to developers who had turned them into wedding venues or luxury vacation rentals, preserving the structures but stripping away the character and history that made them special. Others had been left to rot, slowly crumbling into the sea, their historic significance forgotten in the face of practical realities like cost and accessibility. And still others had been adopted by preservation societies or non-profit organizations, maintained by volunteers and funded by grants and donations. A model that seemed to work for the most iconic lighthouses but might not be feasible for a small, relatively unknown structure on a remote stretch of coast. I found myself going around in circles, my mind cycling through the same options over and over again, each one presenting a different set of trade-offs that I was ill-equipped to evaluate. I could sell the property as is, take whatever money I could get from some developer or private buyer, and use the funds to do something meaningful, perhaps establish a scholarship in my grandfather's name or make a donation to a cause he had cared about. This option was appealing in its simplicity, a clean break that would relieve me of the financial and emotional burden of owning a lighthouse I had never asked for, but it also felt like a betrayal, a rejection of my grandfather's final gift, a decision that would erase whatever legacy he had hoped to leave behind. I could try to rent it out seasonally, making enough money to cover basic maintenance and property taxes while retaining ownership and control. This option would require significant investment upfront to make the cottage habitable for paying guests, but it could generate a steady income stream that would eventually offset the costs of renovation. I had seen stories about lighthouses being converted into vacation rentals, their keepers' cottages transformed into cozy getaways for tourists who wanted to experience the romance of coastal living without the responsibility of actual ownership. The market for such properties seemed strong, especially in Maine, where lighthouses had become symbols of the state's maritime heritage and attracted visitors from around the world. But the logistics were daunting, the licensing and insurance requirements complex, and the ongoing management of a rental property from 800 miles away seemed like a recipe for disaster. I could also hang on to it as a personal project, something I chipped away at over the years, visiting on weekends and holidays, making small repairs when I could afford them, slowly bringing the property back to life even if I never completed the project. This option was the most romantic, the one that aligned most closely with the vision I imagined my grandfather had when he first bought the lighthouse, a dream of restoration and preservation driven by love rather than profit. But it was also the least practical, a commitment of time and money that I was not sure I could sustain over the long term, a project that would likely stretch out for decades and never quite reach completion. I had seen the stories of other lighthouse owners who had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars restoring their properties, working for years alongside volunteers and contractors, struggling to keep the structures standing against the relentless assault of the sea. One Maine writer and retired banker had spent approximately $650,000 to buy and restore Winter Harbor Lighthouse, describing himself not as an owner but as a caretaker, someone entrusted with a special place that belonged as much to history as to any individual. That kind of commitment was admirable, even inspiring, but it required resources I did not have and a level of dedication I was not sure I could muster. I had started reading about other lighthouses in Maine, trying to understand the broader context of what I had inherited and what my options might be. Maine has 66 lighthouses, more than most other states, and they have become central to the state's identity, symbols of a maritime heritage that stretches back centuries. Since the passage of the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act in 2000, 42 of these lighthouses have been transferred to non-profits or sold to private parties, each transaction carrying the mandate to preserve the historic real estate but providing no funding to actually do it. Some of these properties have been turned into museums, welcoming visitors who climb the towers and explore the keepers' houses, learning about the history of the lights and the people who maintained them. Others have become private homes, their owners adapting the unique spaces to modern living while preserving the character and charm of the original structures. Still others have been left to decay, their owners unable or unwilling to bear the costs of maintenance, their futures uncertain. I had read about Boone Island Light, a 133-foot granite tower about 6 miles off the coast of York, which had been sold twice in the span of a few months, its current owner a Delaware-registered LLC whose identity was not publicly disclosed. The property needed extensive repairs, including the interior staircase, and the deed came with covenants that restricted what could be done with the structure, requiring approval from local officials for any renovations or replacements. I had also learned about the American Lighthouse Foundation, an organization that had been founded 20 years ago to enable volunteers to restore and sustain local lights, currently maintaining 18 light stations, 9 of them in Maine. They were one potential option for preserving the lighthouse, a way to pass the responsibility to an organization that had the expertise and resources to maintain it properly, but I was not sure if they would be interested in a small property on a remote stretch of coast, and I was not sure I was ready to let go of the connection to my grandfather that this inheritance represented. The sentimentality I felt was both a strength and a weakness, pulling me in one direction while practicality pulled me in another. I remembered my grandfather's hands, weathered and strong, the hands of a man who had worked with them all his life, and I imagined them touching this lighthouse, repairing the cottage, standing on the point and looking out at the sea that had been his constant companion. He had been a quiet man, not given to emotional displays or long conversations, but he had shown his love through actions, through the care he took with his possessions, through the patience he extended to his grandchildren, through the legacy he had left behind in this unexpected gift. The lighthouse was a part of him, a tangible connection to a man I would never see again, and the thought of selling it to some developer who would turn it into a wedding venue, strip away everything that made it special, and commercialize the history my grandfather had preserved, made me feel physically ill. I wanted to honor his memory, to do right by his final wish, to ensure that this piece of coastal heritage survived for future generations to appreciate. But I also had to be realistic about my own capabilities, about the limits of my time and money, about the fact that a romantic attachment to a property did not automatically translate into the ability to maintain it. I had started to look into the possibility of turning the lighthouse into a vacation rental, a path that some other owners in Maine had successfully pursued. Winter Harbor Lighthouse, an 18-foot tower on a 4-acre island west of Schoodic Peninsula, had been featured in Lighthouse Digest as a potential writer's haven, its keeper's house boasting 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a dining room with a wood stove, and even a music room with an organ. The asking price for that property was $1.25 million, a figure that made my head spin, but it suggested that there was a market for unique coastal properties that offered solitude and inspiration. Nora Head Lighthouse in Australia had spent $77,000 upgrading its keeper's cottage for vacation rentals, installing modern kitchens and laundries, new bathrooms, and even Wi-Fi, while maintaining the historic character of the buildings. The investment had been worthwhile, attracting more than 5,000 guests since the accommodation was established in 2002, and it had created a sustainable income stream that supported the ongoing maintenance of the property. If I could replicate that model on a smaller scale, using the cottage for seasonal rentals while slowly working on the tower itself, I might be able to cover the costs of ownership and eventually make the lighthouse self-sufficient. The logistics were daunting, the upfront investment required to make the cottage habitable was substantial, and the ongoing management from a distance would be challenging. But it was not impossible, and it would allow me to retain ownership and control while generating the revenue I needed to maintain the property. I had also started to consider the possibility of donating the lighthouse to a preservation society or non-profit organization, a course of action that would relieve me of the financial burden while ensuring that the property was protected and maintained. The National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000 had been designed precisely for this purpose, enabling light stations to be acquired by non-profits and, if there were no takers, auctioned off to private parties. The United States Lighthouse Society accepted bequests and donations, using them to preserve lighthouses for future generations, and they could potentially take ownership of the property and manage it as part of their portfolio of historic structures. This option was appealing in its simplicity, a clean transfer of responsibility that would protect the lighthouse without requiring me to spend decades struggling to maintain it. But it also meant letting go entirely, surrendering the connection to my grandfather's legacy, trusting that strangers would care for the property as much as I would have if I had been able to continue his work. The thought made me uncomfortable, a sense that I would be abdicating my responsibility, failing to honor the trust he had placed in me when he chose me as the guardian of his secret treasure. I was stuck between sentiment and practicality, between the heart and the head, between what I wanted to do and what I was actually capable of doing. My grandfather had left me a lighthouse, an actual lighthouse, not because he expected me to spend my life restoring it or to become a lighthouse keeper in the modern sense, but because he wanted me to have something tangible, something he had loved, something that connected me to a part of his life that I had never fully understood. The lighthouse was his gift, his legacy, his way of saying that he believed in me, that he trusted me, that he wanted me to carry forward something that mattered to him. And now I was faced with the weight of that gift, the responsibility of deciding what to do with it, the knowledge that whatever choice I made would have consequences that would ripple outward for years to come. I could sell it and move on, making a clean break that would free me from the burden but also sever the connection to my grandfather's memory. I could keep it and struggle, pouring money and time into a project that might never be finished, trying to honor his legacy while managing my own life and responsibilities. Or I could find some middle ground, some compromise that allowed me to preserve the lighthouse without sacrificing my own financial stability or emotional well-being. The clock was ticking, the main winter was coming, and every passing month would bring more deterioration, more damage, more expense. I needed to make a decision, to choose a path and commit to it, to stop the endless loop of consideration and begin the work of whatever I decided to do. The lighthouse was waiting, standing on that rocky point, battered by the wind and the waves, holding on against the forces that threatened to bring it down. My grandfather was gone, but his legacy remained, and it was up to me to determine what that legacy would become. I thought about the keeper's cottage, about the possibility of making it a home, a retreat, a place where I could escape from the noise and chaos of modern life and connect with something older, something more enduring. I thought about the tower, about the light that had once shone from its summit, guiding ships to safety, a beacon of hope in the darkness. And I thought about my grandfather, about the quiet pride he would have felt if he could have seen me standing here, grappling with this decision, caring about his gift enough to struggle with it. The answer was not clear, the path was not certain, but I knew that I would find my way, that the decision would come in its own time, that whatever choice I made would be the right one because I would make it with love, with care, with a deep and abiding respect for the man who had trusted me with his most precious possession.